makes a precocious young boy fascinated by history and fascinated by archaeology, the son of a professor in a well-to-do family who can travel the world, become a roughhousing, gang-dealing fortune hunter? Is it a chance meeting with a fedora leather jacket wearing man who we only know as Garth or Fedora? Is that alone enough to make him decide that this shady looking character would be who he would model himself after? Is this encounter alone enough to make him go from belongs in a museum to fortune and glory until Temple of Doom? Or is there more? This character that grew up in the 1910s, who fought in the First World War, who worked his way into paying for college, and who entered a job market during the Great Depression. In this video essay, I argue that not only was Indy a product of the First World War, he was very much a product of the Great Depression, and his motto for fortune and glory only exists because of it. Now, there have already been a lot of discussion on Indy's conception as a throwback to the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s serials that George grew up on, as well as some of the comics, Doc Savage, among others, and also some of the movies, the film characters from China, 1943, The Secret of the Incas, and Treasure of Sierra Madre, which he's modeled off of. But one crucial element that's often ignored or forgotten about is that in the complete making of Indiana Jones, it is written that George himself acknowledged this fundamental tension. Right? He was creating this character that was a throwback to past characters, but he also wanted to make him a college professor. As George put it himself, I had at that point a little character backstory, Lucas says, which had come out of the questions: why didn't Indiana Smith become a regular archaeologist? Why did he become a thief? It was hard to figure out in my mind why a professor who can live very modestly would go out and do all this Tomb Raider business and then sell the artifacts to museums. The answer was that he had a habit, the good life. He did it because he had a lavish lifestyle to support. He was addicted to being a playboy, building and expanding upon all his past influences, characters that were flawed, that were troubled, that were motivated and tempted by greed and obsession. He wanted to give that duality between legitimacy and the more anti-hero side of his character, and give him an edge and a reason for why he does what he does, and why he makes compromises. And this aspect of the character is enshrined in the canon itself, but also much more clearly reiterated in the 2008 World of Indiana Jones Ultimate Guide. And this would be great during the Roaring '20s, but absolutely terrible in the Great Depression to have this taste for the high life. And that's something that subsequent authors of the expanded canon have latched onto. Unfortunately, the Young Indiana Chronicles, if it had lasted even just 1 or 2 seasons more, we would have gotten to see Indy meeting Abner, Indy meeting Belloc, as well as several adventures with a university-age Indy meeting and going on expeditions with his professors. Unfortunately, we didn't get that, but we do get sort of an outline of where young Indy ends at Hollywood Follies at the start of his undergrad, and we do get that point later in Temple of Doom, chronologically, to know where George wanted to take the character. When we have his expanded canon, of course, to also fill the gaps, where Indy was supposed to bridge between from being young, world-weary already because of the First World War, but still relatively optimistic, to being the much more darker mercenarial figure of Temple of Doom and of Raiders of the Lost Ark. In the 1920s, we see Indy work as a waiter through college, take on contract jobs in Hollywood in order to get by, in order to pay off his tuition. At the time of Hollywood Follies, the last produced episode of Young Indiana Chronicles, Indy has yet to have the leather jacket, he's yet to really learn how to use the bullwhip, or acquire the other components of his outfit. So at this point, he actually still isn't copying Fedora or Garth yet, which leads to that question of, well, how does he become that? What motivates him to become that? And again, we don't have that component of why does Indy decide to look like Garth or Fedora? And the symbolism of it is that he hasn't fallen so much from the pure faith yet. He is still optimistic. He is still happy to become an archaeologist of the sort that Marcus is, Howard Carter. At this point, Indy is still very much on the road to becoming a much more scholarly straight-laced archaeologist. And by the time he graduates from the University of Chicago, he has a bit of a crisis. And his crisis point is that he goes to the University of Paris, Sorbonne, but he doesn't do it in archaeology. He does linguistics. And it's something that is a pressure from his father, from Senior. Because even in his undergraduate years, Senior sends him an angry letter about how he should study something proper. Because even though Senior is a medieval scholar, he looks down upon archaeology, being more of a dirty, pun intended, job, unlike his much more scholarly reading of the Holy Grail and looking for sites related to the Holy Grail. It's a degree of irony and inconsistency, obviously, and hypocrisy. Indy gives in at the start of his PhD years and does linguistics. That said, a chance meeting with Dr. Dorian Villacamnus, an inventor at Delphi, results in him going back into archaeology and changing his PhD over to becoming an archaeology degree. And when Indy graduates, focusing more on the regions of his interest, right, in the classics, in the Near East, to some extent in South America, he finds himself on a train to get a teaching post in the UK to teach Celtic archaeology, which of course makes no sense, except for the fact that it was a gig that Marcus pulled strings for to get him into. And so from 1925 to 1927, Indy holds a teaching post in London, where he teaches Celtic archaeology, quickly rushing up as much as possible. To do so, and several adventures ensue, including his marriage to Deirdre Campbell, and her subsequent passing after a terrible plane crash in South America. And by 1927, Indy, reaching out to take a leave of absence, is fired from London because of his lack of focus on Celtic archaeology. So now, both grieving the loss of his late wife, and also now the loss of his job, Indy, in 1927, 1 decade before the Great Circle, Indy goes on a hunt to find Noah's Ark. Following the Roaring Twenties comes the stock market crash of 1929 that completely changes the world entirely, leading to a Great Depression that lasted for about a decade until the Second World War began, from 1929 to 1939. Even worse, the Dust Bowl occurs at this time, a series of desert storms that damage the ecology and also agricultural production in the US. Shanty towns known as Hoovervilles, named after the then President Herbert Hoover, and tent cities abound. Job lines and bread lines too. And believe it or not, some families put their children up for sale, unable to feed them. And this period was also defined by a rise in more extreme political viewpoints, driven by economic desperation and frustration with the governments in charge. And the references to the Great Depression extend beyond simply Indy himself. Willie's reason for being in Shanghai is very much because she suffered financial losses in the Great Depression, had to go and find some place that would give her a job. Panama Hat, the old guy whose name we only know by what he's wearing on his head, he also needed to sell the Cross of Coronado because of the Great Depression. Salituk is affected, and in the 1920s, 1930s, there are fewer projects for him to work on, and that's also probably why by 1936 in Raiders, he's working on Belloc's project, and why also Indy isn't that bothered by it. Other smaller characters were affected by the Great Depression, completely changing their trajectories in life. And it's both the fundamental reality of that time period, and also part of the zeitgeist of why in the 1930s, some of those serials focus so much on finding treasure or finding fantastical lands. They were very much escapists, avoiding the harsh realities of tent cities and job lines and trying to scrimp and save just to get by every day. 1 year after the stock market crash, we find Indy in Uppsala, Sweden, looking for the old temple of Uppsala. Stuck in the winter, Indy pushes through, much against the recommendations of Marcus, who also joins him. Finding the temple and trying to get ahead of Forrestal, Indy meets Teresa, a British museum archaeologist, also on the hunt for the same site. And inside, they find a scroll and a ring. Unfortunately, Teresa ends up taking both and blocking Indy in the temple itself, though she loses the scroll to Belloc. Indy manages to escape and goes back to see Marcus. Unfortunately, at this point, Marcus decides to give up on trying to recover them from Teresa because of the Great Depression. In fact, he emphatically states, "There's no more money, Indy. I had to plead with them to fund this goose chase as it is. The crash has not been easy on academics, not at all. In a dying economy, nobody cares about history, I'm afraid." Indy, of course, tempts him with being able to fund a project in Great Zimbabwe if they were able to get the ring back. And of course, Marcus being tempted by this, relents. The story continues, and he finds out that Belloc stole the scroll, and that is the more important artifact. Later on, Marcus is attacked, and another setback occurs. Indy, of course, again asks for more money, and Marcus, much too exhausted now, simply states that. And the answer has to be no this time. I can't ask for more money. I've had to promise the museum too much as it is, and coming home with nothing. Well, I'm afraid this could be our last adventure for a while. Maybe I can find a curatorial position somewhere small. Maybe a nice pottery museum in the Midwest. And you could look for more professorial work. Move in with your father for a while. And of course, Indy states no, absolutely not an option. And promises Marcus that he'll get the money. And he tries to sweet talk Teresa into funding them going to get the scroll back from Belloc. In the end, Indy does get the scroll back. Teresa manages to take it, but gets duped into giving it to someone else on the airplane, which is clearly a scam, leaving them with nothing. Except Indy, at the end of the story, steals the ring that they had found earlier from under Teresa's nose from the British Museum and gives it to Marcus as a consolation prize. Marcus believes it to be enough to keep the museum satisfied, to at least sort of partially make up for funding them on this goose chase. And so we essentially find Indy in 1930 really pressing his luck. Marcus's job is also now on the line too. And essentially, flashing 2 years later, Indy gets fired from Princeton because the British Honduran government, now known as Belize, found Indy within their borders without a permit. And this is partly because of him wandering into the wrong country. Now fired and penniless, he goes and visits Marcus again. Now he is at the American Museum of Natural History, and it seems for the past 2 years, Brody has been named Director of Special Acquisitions for the American Museum of Natural History in New York, and the institution had quietly funded Indy's research. The arrangement had enriched the museum's collection while allowing Indy the freedom to travel, which is a luxury not afforded to many by the salary of a university professor during the Great Depression. And that's partly because during this period, all fieldwork had to be curtailed in real life. And Max McCoy actually had done the research, and one of the wonderful things about some of these novels is that in the back pages there is a real-life history for readers interested in. So it seems that Indy and Marcus developed a special arrangement, which is a little bit shady, very shady in fact. Indy, by the end of the story, manages to find the Philosopher's Stone, but also keep his job at Princeton, thankfully. In the next story, Indiana Jones and the Dinosaur Eggs. Yes, that is the title. We are still in 1933, and Indy, in fact, this time around, complains to Marcus about funding a foolhardy trip abroad. The museum isn't capable of financing a full-blown expedition, Indy protested. In fact, using museum money for expeditions or fieldwork has been strictly forbidden for the last 2 years. That's why Marcus has relied on my one-man procuratorial service to keep the collections up to date. That's true, Brody said. The Depression has hit the museums as hard as any institution, and it is unfortunate that so much museum money was tied up in railroad bonds. But Indy, this is different. I'm sure that I can convince the old man that this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. So, again, the two of them are thick as thieves, metaphorically and somewhat literally, promising things to the museums and institutions that they work for. Right before the start of Emperor's Tomb in the Emperor's Tomb game manual, back in the time period when these game manuals were works of art, there's a bit on Indy's research. He states, I've contacted the National Archaeology College Association regarding Barnett's contributing budget for fieldwork. So now he's at Barnett instead of Princeton. Recent funding from the WPA, or Works Progress Administration, a program that was developed under the Roosevelt administration to give work and jobs to people, has increased my overall expense margin, but the board seems to think I'm more of a grave robber than a historian. Apparently the Works Progress Administration specifies rigid guidelines for conservation archaeology. At least the museum knows I'm only interested in preserving and protecting antiquities from profit hunters. So therein lies the slight difference between how Indy views himself and how he views other people that he believes to actually be grave robbers. For him, it seems to be a case where he's trying to do more illicit activities in order to guarantee more funding so that he can run larger projects in the Great Depression. So we're seeing the clash of his young ideals from the 1920s up against the harsh realities of trying to fund research during this time, and also his attempts at trying to bring back objects as a way to fund new research backfiring on him entirely, because it only makes his colleagues, and also many governments, just think of him as being nothing more than the thief or a grave robber. And this is where he starts racking up his bad reputation that we see in Temple of Doom. I mentioned briefly the British Honduras example, which is mentioned in Temple of Doom, that he's wanted by the government. He's also, at some point here, wanted by the Sultan of Madagascar, of course, and in many references across the novels during this time period. He is often called not only an eminent archaeologist, but also sometimes a grave robber, and he's building quite a negative reputation. From the manual, though, we also see that the cover, this calling card, which is the Indiana Jones logo, of course, that actually makes it into canon technically as being a calling card that Indy himself develops. So Indy's trying to sell himself in many ways in this harsh time. And this reputation ultimately plagues him for a long time. And he jumps between many different employment circumstances. In some cases he's working for the government, like in Raiders. In some cases he's working for Marshall, and he goes back and forth, right? He's 1935, he finds himself in Barnet, according to Emperor's Tomb. By the time we get to Temple of Doom, Indy is making deals with Lao She, willing to be tempted to take the Sankara stones, and having moments of just reminding himself and Shorty of fortune and glory. And that becomes his motto because of all what's happened in the past decade. Going from trying to work his way into getting a degree, to getting multiple degrees, getting multiple jobs, getting fired several times, changing up circumstances, losing his wife. We actually get a very bitter and raw version of Indy by 1935. He retains his humanity in many ways. He retains elements of his optimistic self, but it's a lot more muted now. And so the setup to Temple of Doom isn't that he's just jumping from, belongs to a museum as a kid and then straight to Temple of Doom where he's become who he is in this time period. He's very much made the decision in his bitterness, in his frustration at his sort of financial and career situation to become more like Garth or Fedora. He is referred to as both. He takes on the identity against his father's overwhelming pressure. As a professor, he continues to dress much like his father. But outside of that, as Indiana Jones, he models himself off of as the counterpoint to his father, as the more kind of freewheeling spirit that's free from all the pressures of the Great Depression and the harsh realities of having to garner enough funding for major projects.
Still there, Marcus?
Indiana, I have to tell you something.
Well, what is it?
The college administration, they decided to let you go.
In a second. They're gonna fire me?
I told you that running off during midterms would get you in trouble, old boy.
Oh, okay. Look, Marcus. I can't stop now. I'm committed.
Of course, by Raiders, and especially Last Crusade, where Indy faces both his history with his father and his temptations for the Grail, and ultimately, in a sense, conquers this need for fortune and glory. And Indy, in a sense, regains his sense of self and meaning that is not only no longer tied to his frustrations with money, about doing bigger projects. He's sort of made peace with the ups and downs, the way things go, and he actually finds success in that way. There are some occasional mix-ups too, but he's definitely become a much more legitimate archaeologist at this point. In 1941, he goes to Peru and he's doing a proper archaeological excavation. He's got the permits in hand in Pyramid of the Sorcerer, and of course he gets framed, and people working with him bring in wanted posters about how he's a grave robber, which leads to Indy having to run away from the Peruvian army, only to find out that Colonel Musgrove, the guy we saw in Raiders of the Lost Ark, was responsible for doing that just to be able to give him a mission to work for Army intelligence again. Something that really wouldn't happen today within the age of the cell phone. But overall, he isn't under the same harsh lens by the people around him, by the world around him either. He's much more accepted by his colleagues and even hailed as a hero. At the end of the Great Depression, another war begins, and he finds his skills as an archaeologist necessary and important, as well as his language skills and his prior background in World War I to be useful again, either to recover objects or to fight the Axis powers in his own way. For military intelligence, for the OSS, for the Monuments and Fine Arts Commission, it's sort of implied that he is a monuments man. So in the war, despite all his economic hardships and career difficulties, he finds himself becoming a soldier again, becoming a spy again, but this time wiser, this time older, and this time more focused on finding objects that Axis powers have taken and trying to, in a sense, even repatriate them, something that he's always struggled with. To taking objects from museums versus trying to return them, and that is something that he continues to do after the Second World War, after the Monuments Men program. The Monuments and Fine Arts Commission closes at 1947. He continues to actually work with Marcus in West Germany. So he's still there with Marcus in the American zone, trying to repatriate objects. So even to now, he's also a part of repatriation processes too, albeit with European art in Germany. But he's also later on, by 1951, involved in working with Grey Cloud to recover ancestral objects. And his career after the war actually continues to pick up. We see a lot more instances of him doing proper archaeology, interestingly enough, whether that's intentional by the authors and by Lucasfilm and George Lucas when it was still under his control is an interesting question. But Indy certainly in Infernal Machine, he's digging in square units for sure. He's properly doing excavation, even though the rest of the story pulls him out of it. And even by Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, he has written enough books to have influenced Mutt as a kid. And he is very much the elder professor now, much more satisfied. He wears his professor's suit with much more confidence and comfort, as opposed to his early Raiders and Last Crusade depictions where he always looks just a teensy bit too uncomfortable in that suit. And also at the start of Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, he is actually in a major project in Central America, where he's actually doing proper archaeology, has a full team that unfortunately get massacred by Spalco's men, and that's why he ends up in the truck at the start of Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. By the 1960s, Indy's subject to the loss of his son, and temporarily feeling this loss of his sort of sense of self again in terms of his career, in terms of his love for archaeology. He is still very much passionate about archaeology, talking about Archimedes. And even though Indy eventually goes on to suffer more tragedy in his life through the loss of Mutt, he does become a character that is more introspective, much more less likely to run away from his problems, much more noble in nature. Right? He, as much as he is mourning the loss of Mutt, as soon as Helena comes to talk to him about finding this dial, it's within the span of a few hours he's already still actively engaged, joining the adventure. He doesn't do things so much for himself as much as he does that for others now. It's the same for going back to Crystal Skull. The adventure starts off because he's worried about Oxley and about Mutt's mother. He finds out later is married, of course, but he doesn't know that then. His intentions, his goals are much more noble in this post-war period. And of course, even though it's a little bit less in the canon because George edited the DVD versions, Indy eventually grows into being this wily old man that tells stories and tries to help people around his town. Indy's life is very much reflective of the 20th century, essentially. He goes from everything from dealing with the early 1900s questions of European imperialism and colonialism, to joining the First World War, to the Great Depression, to Second World War, to the post-war boom, Vietnam, and so on. And there's a lot to be said about this character. And as much as the Indiana Jones series is not about very deep, complicated questions and feelings of pathos and drama per se, it's very much a swashbuckling adventure series. But it does have those elements, whether it's George, Spielberg, Mangold, or Harrison himself, and the countless authors and game developers that added to this canon. It is a cohesive whole of a very complete person from childhood all the way into his old age, and one that I think defies some of the more simplistic interpretations that we've seen of the character. And he has a powerful change through this time. And there's a lot more to the character and his motivations and the intentions in terms of the creation of the character than I think what a lot of memes and jokes about the character have been, whether it's about him being simply a grave robber or simply a bad archaeologist. In many ways, he is, but the character was not written to make him the best archaeologist or make him a simple heroic figure. He is a complex character subject to obsessions, temptations, very human fallacies that in many ways he's praised for, but which extend across different aspects of the character, far more than simply his ability to, or inability to, fight people with his fists. And his character was written with this sense of self-awareness, whether it's George or the other subsequent authors wrote in tongue-in-cheek forms of acknowledgement of the character being a bad archaeologist, but also connecting it to the character development that maybe gets lost in translation for some of the audience. Thanks for watching, and hope you enjoyed it. First time I ever tried doing a video essay, so if you liked it, please let me know, and I will see you next time.